Every year, Americans spend over $70 billion on weight loss products, pills, powders, programs. And in 2024, the rate of abdominal obesity in adults over 60 is higher than it has ever been recorded. Meanwhile, the Ebers Papyrus, a medical document written in Egypt around 1550 BCE, older than the Book of Exodus, lists specific plant-based preparations for what ancient physicians called excess accumulation around the center. They weren't using the words visceral fat, but they were observing the same condition and treating it with foods that modern biochemistry is now confirming had genuine mechanisms, not magic, mechanisms. Today we are counting down 13 foods that directly target the biological processes that create and sustain visceral fat in people over 60. Each one has a documented history reaching back thousands of years, used independently across civilizations that had no contact with each other. Each one has been studied at the molecular level. Stay with me. Through number 1, most people have had it sitting in their garden for years and have no idea what it is quietly capable of. And somewhere in the middle of this list, we are going to stop and examine a moment from the book of 1 Kings. A man in a desert, 3 days without food or water, in complete physical collapse. What he was given next, and what happened to his body, is not just scripture. It is a physiological account that modern researchers are beginning to examine in an entirely new light. Number 13. Apple cider vinegar. The Book of Ruth, Chapter 2. Verse 14. Boaz offers Ruth bread and tells her to dip it in the vinegar. Easily overlooked. But vinegar in the ancient Near East was not a condiment. It was a medicinal preparation that traveled with Roman legions, was stored in Egyptian households, and appears in ancient Chinese medical texts under the name ku jiao, meaning bitter wine, recommended for what practitioners described as heaviness of the abdomen. 3 cultures, no contact, the same preparation, the same complaint. The active compound responsible for apple cider vinegar's metabolic effects is acetic acid. When absorbed through the intestinal wall, it activates an enzyme called AMPK, adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase, in liver and muscle tissue. AMPK functions as a master metabolic switch when active. Cells shift from fat storage toward fat oxidation. A randomized controlled trial published in Bioscience, Biotechnology, and Biochemistry found that participants who consumed 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar daily for 12 weeks showed statistically significant reductions in visceral fat area as measured by CT scan, independent of any caloric change. The visceral fat specifically, not total weight. The internal, organ surrounding fat. A second mechanism involves acetic acid's effect on blood glucose. Consumed before a carbohydrate meal, it slows gastric emptying, reducing the insulin spike that follows. Since chronically elevated insulin is a primary driver of visceral fat accumulation after 60, this is not a minor benefit. 1 tablespoon diluted in 8 ounces of water, 15 minutes before your largest meal. Do not drink it. Undiluted, the acetic acid concentration is sufficient to erode tooth enamel. Look for raw, unfiltered vinegar with visible sediment, what the industry calls the mother, which the filtered, refined versions have removed. The Roman soldiers called their diluted vinegar drink posca. They didn't know about AMPK. They knew it kept them alert and reduced what they called bloating of the belly. The research is now catching up to what they observed. Number 12. Turmeric. Turmeric appears in Sanskrit medical texts dating to approximately 600 BCE under the name Haridra. The Ayurvedic physician Karaka described it as a remedy for what he called medodushti, literally, corruption of fat tissue. Ancient Chinese medicine incorporated it for what practitioners described as stagnation of the center. And in Proverbs, chapter 7, verse 17, among the spices listed myrrh, Aloe. Cinnamon ancient commentators include what is believed to be an early reference to the bright yellow root that was one of the most traded commodities on the ancient spice routes. The active compound is curcumin, one of the most extensively studied natural anti-inflammatory compounds in the scientific literature. Visceral fat secretes cytokines, specifically interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, that create a self-sustaining inflammatory environment, making visceral fat increasingly resistant to metabolic breakdown. Curcumin directly blocks the NF-kB pathway, the upstream switch, controlling the production of both. It targets the specific mechanism visceral fat uses to protect itself. A clinical trial published in the European Review for Medical and Pharmacological Sciences found that curcumin supplementation produced significant reductions in waist circumference, the external measurement most closely correlated with visceral fat volume. Here is the preparation detail that changes everything. Curcumin on its own is very poorly absorbed. Studies suggest fewer than 3% reaches circulation without assistance. The compound that fixes this is piperine, found in black pepper. Research published in Planta Medica found that a quarter teaspoon of freshly ground black pepper increases curcumin bioavailability by an estimated 2,000%. The ancient Ayurvedic texts combined these two spices consistently. They did not know why. The biochemistry has since explained it. Half a teaspoon of ground turmeric with a pinch of black pepper. In warm, not boiling water or milk. Add a small amount of fat, because curcumin is fat-soluble. This preparation, golden milk, has a documented history of over 2,000 years. It is now the subject of active pharmaceutical research. Number 11. Walnuts. The Romans called the walnut Juglans regia, the royal acorn of Jupiter, and distributed it across their empire as both food and medicine. In the Song of Solomon, chapter 6, egos, the Hebrew word for nuts, refers to the garden visited by the beloved. Ancient Persian physicians described walnut consumption as a remedy for what they called fat of the organs. And archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia suggests cultivation stretching back to at least 7,000 BCE. Walnuts are the only common tree nut with meaningful concentrations of alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, the plant-based precursor to the omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, and DHA. 1 ounce provides 2.5 grams of ALA, exceeding the daily adequate intake. In the context of visceral fat, omega-3s work through a protein called adiponectin, a hormone that, when elevated, signals visceral fat cells to release stored energy. Low adiponectin correlates almost perfectly with high visceral fat, but here is what most people miss. Walnuts contain elagitanin, polyphenols that gut bacteria metabolize into compounds called urolithins. Urolithins are the subject of active research for their role in mitophagy, the selective removal of damaged mitochondria. Damaged mitochondria accumulate after 60 and slow cellular metabolism. Walnut consumption, through urolithin production, may support the cellular cleanup process that keeps metabolism efficient. Research from the Salk Institute, published in Nature Metabolism, described urolithins as among the most promising compounds for age-related metabolic decline. 1 ounce consumed in the afternoon. Do not buy pre-chopped or roasted polyunsaturated fats oxidize rapidly once exposed to heat and air. Buy whole raw walnuts. Break them yourself. Store in the refrigerator. The slight bitterness is the L-agitanin content. The bitterness is the medicine. Number 10. Legumes. Lentils are mentioned in Genesis. Chapter 25. Esau returns from the field exhausted and sells his birthright for a bowl of red lentil stew. It is easy to read this as a story of impulsive choice. But food historians note that lentil stew, specifically red lentils, was considered genuine restorative food in the ancient Near East. Consumed after physical labor, after illness, after long travel. It was not cheap food. It was sustaining food. The same distinction was made independently by ancient Indian Ayurvedic physicians. who called lentils masoor dal and specifically recommended them for what they described as weakness of the digestive fire and heaviness of the center. Traditional Chinese medicine categorized legumes as foods that support the spleen's function of transforming and transporting a description that maps, with surprising precision, to what we now understand as glycemic regulation and metabolic efficiency. Legumes have an exceptionally low glycemic index. They cause a slow, sustained rise in blood glucose and a proportionally modest insulin response. This is critical because chronically elevated insulin is one of the primary hormonal signals that instructs the body to store fat viscerally. Every significant insulin spike sends a biological directive deposit fat centrally. Legumes help keep that signal quiet across the entire day, beyond glycemic control. Legumes are among the richest dietary sources of resistant starch. This is a form of fiber that human digestive enzymes cannot break down. It travels intact into the colon, where it feeds the bacteria that produce short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate. Butyrate has been shown in multiple studies to reduce systemic inflammation, support the integrity of the intestinal lining, and directly downregulate the expression of genes involved in fat cell formation. Otherverse. Butyrate-producing gut microbiome is one of the most consistent biological correlates of lower visceral fat. Independent of total caloric intake, 1 cup of cooked legumes per day. Lentils require no soaking and cook in 25 minutes. If gas is a concern, a common issue, as gut microbiome composition shifts, after 60 begin with smaller portions and allow 2 to 3 weeks for the gut bacteria to adjust. Rinse canned legumes thoroughly. The liquid they are stored in contains excess sodium that counteracts some of the metabolic benefit. Number 9. Extra virgin olive oil. Olive oil, in ancient scripture, is not background detail. It is the medium of anointing, of healing, of consecration. In Exodus 27, God instructs Moses to prepare pure, beaten olive oil for the lamp of the tabernacle, not pressed. Beaten, a specific preparation method that preserves more of the oil's volatile aromatic compounds. In the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10, the Samaritan pours oil and wine on the wounds, a combination that ancient physicians across the Mediterranean world had long used as an antiseptic and anti-inflammatory preparation. The Greeks anointed athletes with it before competition. The Egyptians stored it in alabaster vessels as a luxury medicinal substance. The compound most responsible for extra virgin olive oil's anti-inflammatory power is oleocanthal. Oleocanthal inhibits the same enzymatic pathway, the COX enzyme system targeted by ibuprofen. The mechanism is documented and well understood. The difference is that oleocanthal does this without the gastrointestinal risks associated with long-term NSAID use, which matters considerably for adults over 60 who are often already managing multiple medications. The PrediMed trial, one of the largest nutrition intervention studies ever conducted, involving over 7,000 participants, found that daily extra virgin olive oil consumption produced measurably lower visceral fat levels compared to low-fat dietary controls, alongside significantly fewer cardiovascular events. The visceral fat reduction was attributed primarily to oleocanthal's suppression of the inflammatory environment that allows visceral fat to sustain and expand. Here is what most people do not know. The peppery, slightly burning sensation at the back of the throat that you experience with high-quality extra virgin olive oil, that is the oleocanthal. Lower quality oils refined. Blended. Light do not produce that sensation because the oleocanthal has been removed by heat and chemical processing. The burn is the medicine. If the olive oil you are using has no peppery finish, it is not delivering the compound you are after. 2 tablespoons per day. Over salads. Drizzled over cooked vegetables. Or consumed directly. Never heat it past the smoke point, approximately 400 degrees Fahrenheit, because high heat degrades the polyphenol content. Use it finishing, not frying. Number 8. Garlic. There is a moment in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, verse 5, where the Israelites in the wilderness cry out not for bread, but for garlic. They are mourning it, alongside fish, cucumbers, melons, lakes, and onions. Garlic was so fundamental to the Egyptian diet that Greek historian Herodotus records that the laborers who built the Great Pyramid consumed vast quantities of it, believing it maintained their strength and protected them from illness. Ancient Indian physicians described it as rasona lacking one rasa, or taste, because it possessed 5 of the 6 flavor categories in Ayurvedic theory, but not the 6th. Chinese medical texts from the Han Dynasty used it specifically for what practitioners described as fullness and accumulation in the middle. The active compound in raw garlic is allicin, released when garlic is crushed or chopped and exposed to air for 10 minutes before consumption or cooking. Allicin has been shown in peer-reviewed studies to reduce visceral fat accumulation by suppressing the expression of a gene called PPAR gamma, which governs the differentiation of pre-adipocytes, precursor cells, into mature fat cells. Fewer mature fat cells means less visceral fat storage capacity. A 2011 clinical study found that garlic supplementation produced significant reductions in visceral fat without any other dietary modification, attributed primarily to allicin's effect on circulating insulin levels and on the genetic machinery of fat cell creation. But there is a second mechanism that is rarely discussed. Garlic measurably reduces cortisol, the stress hormone that becomes chronically elevated in many adults over 60. When cortisol is persistently high, the body locks fat into the abdominal region as emergency energy storage. Allicin's cortisol-lowering effect directly loosens that lock. 2 to 3 fresh cloves per day. Crush them. Let them rest 10 full minutes before cooking. This allows the alliinase enzyme to complete the conversion of alliin into allicin. If you cook garlic immediately after crushing, before the conversion is complete, you lose the majority of the bioactive compound. Those 10 minutes are not optional. Add to whatever you are already making soups. Eggs, vegetables. The compound survives moderate cooking temperatures. Number 7. Green tea. In the Chinese medical classic Shennong Bencao Jing, written around 200 CE and attributed to the legendary emperor Shennong, tea is described as a treatment for what practitioners called turbidity of the middle, a phrase used to describe what we would today recognize as metabolic dysfunction and abdominal weight gain. Japanese Buddhist monks in the 12th century brought green tea cultivation techniques from China and promoted it specifically as a substance that supported mental clarity and what they described as lightness of the body. And while the word tea does not appear in biblical texts, ancient Middle Eastern physicians were using preparations from Camellia sinensis leaves along the Silk Road trade routes no later than the 1st century CE. Green tea contains a specific catechin called EGCG, epigallocatechin gallate. EGCG is one of the most comprehensively studied natural compounds in the scientific literature on visceral fat reduction. A randomized controlled trial published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that participants who consumed EGCG daily for 12 weeks lost an average of 17% more visceral fat than the placebo group, not total, body fat, specifically and measurably visceral fat. The mechanism is well understood. EGCG activates AMPK, the same master metabolic switch mentioned earlier, specifically in visceral adipose tissue. When AMPK is active in fat cells, they shift from storage into mobilization mode. EGCG drives this process most powerfully in the deep abdominal fat. Here is the preparation detail that most people miss entirely. Green tea brewed in water above 175 degrees Fahrenheit undergoes a chemical change that converts the beneficial catechins into bitter-tasting tannins that have significantly reduced EGCG activity. The ideal brewing temperature for green tea is 160 to 170 degrees water that has been boiled and then allowed to rest for 3 to 4 minutes. Steep for 3 minutes only. Oversteeping also drives catechin degradation, and research from the University of Purdue found that adding a small amount of citric acid, the juice of a lemon, to brewed green tea increases the stability of EGCG in the digestive system by up to 13 times. Because the acidic environment protects the compound from degradation before it reaches the intestine. 3 cups per day. Brewed correctly. With a wedge of lemon. Number 6. Fatty fish. This is the entry where we stop. 1 Kings, chapter 19. The prophet Elijah has just come through one of the most intense physical ordeals in the Hebrew Bible. He called down fire. He outran a chariot in a rainstorm for 17 miles. And then, faced with a death threat, something broke in him completely. He fled into the wilderness. He sat down under a broom tree and said, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life." He lay down and slept. An angel touched him. "Arise and eat." There at his head was a cake baked on hot coals and a jar of water. He ate. He lay back down. The angel came again. "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." And it says he arose and ate and drank. And with the strength of that food he walked 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. That isn't poetry. That is a description of physiological restoration, following what we would today call a complete adrenal and cortisol crash, total glycogen depletion, elevated stress hormones, inflammatory response from extreme exertion. His body had consumed itself. 40 days of walking cannot be explained by bread and water alone. The physiological reality of such a recovery requires anti-inflammatory compounds to reset a cytokine storm. Omega-3 fatty acids to restore cell membrane integrity after oxidative stress. And nutrients that repair the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis after cortisol exhaustion. Modern research has identified exactly which nutrients do all three simultaneously. EPA and DHA, the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids concentrated in fatty fish, salmon, sardines, mackerel, herring. These omega-3s raise adiponectin, directly signaling visceral fat to release stored energy. They suppress interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, the cytokine's visceral fat secretes to protect itself. They restore cell membrane fluidity, the property that governs insulin receptor function. A study published in the International Journal of Obesity found that adults consuming fatty fish twice per week lost significantly more visceral fat over 12 weeks than participants eating identical total calories without it. 2 to 3 servings per week. Canned sardines packed in olive oil are equally effective by every biomarker measurement and combine 2 items from this list at once. The prophet walked 40 days. We cannot know everything that sustained him, but the physiological requirements of that journey describe precisely what omega-3 fatty acids provide to a depleted body. If this kind of ancient knowledge resonates with you, hit like and subscribe because what's coming next goes even deeper. Number 5. Cruciferous vegetables. The Book of Daniel. Chapter 1. Nebuchadnezzar's court has offered Daniel and his companions the finest food in Babylon meat from the royal table, wine from the king's cellar. Daniel asks instead for vegetables and water. After 10 days, Daniel and his companions appeared healthier and better nourished than all the young men eating the royal food. This account has been read theologically for millennia. Nutritionally, only recently. What ancient Palestine produced in abundance that the Babylonian royal table almost certainly lacked were cruciferous plants, wild mustard greens, early forms of kale, radishes, and turnip-like plants native to the Levant. Ayurvedic texts describe Sarshapa mustard family plants as treatments for excess accumulation in the belly region. The mechanism that makes these vegetables specifically effective after 60 involves hormonal biochemistry that conventional medicine rarely addresses. As we age, a process called aromatization converts testosterone into estrogen in both men and women. Visceral fat tissue is a particularly active conversion site. More visceral fat produces more aromatase activity, more estrogen, which drives further visceral fat accumulation. A self-sustaining cycle. Cruciferous vegetables contain indole 3-carbinol, converted in digestion into diindolyl methane (DIM), which guides excess estrogen toward a less potent metabolite rather than the form that drives fat storage. It disrupts the hormonal environment visceral fat depends on. A second mechanism, cruciferous vegetables are rich in sulforaphane, produced when they are chewed or chopped. Sulforaphane activates NRF2, a transcription factor that upregulates the body's endogenous antioxidant production, including glutathione. Here's the preparation detail that matters. Boiling cruciferous vegetables for more than 7 minutes destroys the myrosinase enzyme required to produce sulforaphane, reducing active compound content by up to 70%. Steam briefly, 3 to 4 minutes, or eat raw. Number 4. Eggs. Eggs appear throughout ancient dietary records across Egypt, Greece, China, and the Levant. The Roman agricultural writer Columella described them as essential daily food for anyone recovering from illness. Hippocrates included them in restorative protocols for the depleted and the elderly. For decades, eggs were incorrectly targeted as a cardiovascular risk based on cholesterol content. A 2019 analysis in the British Medical Journal, tracking nearly 1 million participants, found no significant association between moderate egg consumption and cardiovascular events in healthy adults. The science has been reviewed. The consensus has shifted. What makes eggs specifically valuable for visceral fat reduction after 60 is 3 things. First, protein quality. All 9 essential amino acids in proportions that match human metabolic requirements almost exactly. Protein has a high thermic effect. Your body burns more energy, digesting it, and suppresses ghrelin, the hunger hormone, elevated in many people over 60. Second, choline, a nutrient over 90% of adults over 60 consume in inadequate amounts. Choline is required for the liver to package and export fat via VLDL particles. A choline-deficient liver accumulates fat rather than exporting it, with a condition non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, now estimated to affect 40% of adults over 60, directly correlated with visceral fat. Third, the yolk contains lutein and zeaxanthin, carotenoids that concentrate in visceral adipose tissue and reduce its inflammatory signaling capacity. 2 eggs per day, prepared with minimal heat, soft-boiled, poached, or gently scrambled. High-heat frying in refined oils oxidizes yolk cholesterol into oxysterols, which are the genuinely problematic form. The method matters. Gentle heat preserves the nutritional architecture. Number 3. Blueberries. The ancient Celts called bilberries the European wild cousin of the blueberry Dirk Frauick, the berry of the heather, and consumed them specifically during periods of illness and recovery. Viking sagas record them as provisions on sea voyages. In Native American traditional medicine, wild blueberries were used as preparations for what healers described as swelling of the belly, a condition that modern epidemiology would now recognize as visceral obesity. Bilberries appear in Anglo-Saxon herbals as treatments for inflammation. And while the exact plant does not appear in biblical texts by name, the Hebrew term perifruit, generically in Proverbs 3, verse 18, was specifically associated by ancient commentators with dark-skinned berries abundant in the Galilee region. Blueberries are among the richest dietary sources of anthocyanins, a class of flavonoid antioxidants whose effects on fat metabolism have been studied in extraordinary depth over the past 2 decades. A University of Michigan study demonstrated that animals fed a blueberry-enriched diet accumulated significantly less visceral fat than control animals with identical caloric intake. The variable was only the blueberries. The fat accumulation was dramatically different. In human studies, the mechanism operates through 2 pathways. First, Anthocyanins suppress fat cell differentiation at the level of gene expression, specifically by downregulating PPAR gamma, the same master regulator of fat cell formation mentioned in the garlic entry. They interfere with the body's ability to create new fat cells before those cells have formed. Second, they directly reduce circulating interleukin 6 and TNF-alpha, the cytokines that visceral fat secretes to sustain itself. Here is what most blueberry research doesn't communicate clearly. The anthocyanin content of blueberries is concentrated almost entirely in and immediately beneath the skin. The flesh of the berry is largely water and fructose. Smaller wild blueberries, typically sold frozen, have a higher skin-to-flesh ratio than the large cultivated varieties, which means gram for gram. Frozen wild blueberries deliver significantly more anthocyanins than the fresh large berry varieties at most supermarkets. Frozen is not a compromise. In this case, frozen is superior. 1 cup per day. Added to plain full-fat yogurt, the combination of anthocyanins and the probiotic cultures in yogurt has been shown to enhance the gut microbiome diversity associated with lower visceral fat, or eaten plain, or added to oatmeal. Number 2. Avocado. In Mesoamerican cultures, stretching back 4,000 years, the avocado was called ahuacatel. Aztec physicians used it specifically for what they described as fat of the center that will not leave. Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century documented indigenous healers prescribing it for abundance of the belly. And while the avocado does not appear in biblical texts by name, olive oil, which runs throughout both testaments, shares the same active fatty acid that makes avocado metabolically extraordinary, oleic acid. Oleic acid activates a gene pathway called PPAR-alpha in liver and muscle cells, instructing them to use fat as fuel rather than store it. A landmark study at Penn State University found that participants who consumed 1 avocado daily for 12 weeks showed a statistically significant reduction in visceral fat compared to a control group eating identical calories from other fat source. Same calories, different fat, different outcome. The mechanism was oleic acid. The result was specifically visceral fat, beyond oleic acid. Avocado contains more potassium than a banana, which counters the sodium-driven water retention that accumulates around visceral fat deposits. It also contains prebiotic fiber that preferentially feeds lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, the gut bacteria most directly associated with reduced visceral adiposity. Preparation detail: avocado flesh begins oxidizing within 30 minutes of cutting. The brown discoloration is evidence of bioactive compound loss. To slow it, keep the pit embedded. Press plastic wrap directly against the surface and add lemon juice. The citric acid creates an acidic microenvironment that slows polyphenol oxidation significantly. Half an avocado per day. Morning or midday. Do not refrigerate uncut cold interrupts the enzymatic ripening that develops its full oleic acid concentration. Number 1. Perslan. You have almost certainly pulled this plant out of your garden and thrown it away. Portulaca oleracea. A low-growing, fleshy weed with small rounded leaves and yellow flowers. Growing in sidewalk cracks, along garden borders, between paving stones. In North America and most of Europe, it is a nuisance. In every other part of the world with a documented ancient food culture, it is a medicine. Purslane is mentioned in the Talmud tractate Sheviot as a permitted food plant during the sabbatical year. Dioscorides, the ancient Greek physician, prescribed it specifically for swelling of the belly. Pliny the Elder described it as a treatment for inflammation. Ancient Chinese physicians listed it in the Materia Medica as machi cien horse tooth amaranth for accumulation in the center. Ayurvedic texts call it loni. A cooling anti-inflammatory food. 5 ancient medical traditions. No shared communication. The same plant. The same applications. Here is why this matters biochemically. Purslane contains more omega, 3 fatty acids than any other leafy green plant on Earth. Its ALA content exceeds that of spinach by a factor of 5. It is also one of the richest plant sources of melatonin. Most people know melatonin only as a sleep aid. What is far less known is that melatonin activates brown adipose tissue, the metabolically active fat that burns energy rather than storing it, and reduces visceral adiposity in research models with a consistency scientists consider worth. Continued investigation. Purslane also contains betalain pigments, the same compounds that give red beets their color, shown to reduce NF-κB inflammatory signaling. The same pathway targeted by curcumin, and it contains glutathione in intact. Bioavailable form, a rare dietary source of the body's primary cellular antioxidant. 1 plant. Omega-3 cis. Melatonin, betalains. Glutathione. Growing in your garden right now? Being composted, eat it raw. Heat degrades the omega-3 content significantly. Young leaves are mild and slightly lemony. Add to salads. Blend with blueberries. Or wilt briefly with garlic and olive oil. Combining 3 entries from this list in one preparation. Identify it carefully before harvesting thick reddish stems. Small, succulent, rounded leaves, and confirm no herbicide exposure in recent growing seasons. Seeds are widely available, and it grows prolifically with almost no attention. Modern agribusiness had no commercial interest in a weed that grows for free, so it disappeared from the Western table. The research is beginning to restore its reputation. Here is the principle that runs through every one of these 13 foods. Each one works through its naturally occurring bioactive compounds. Curcumin in turmeric, allicin in garlic, EGCG in green tea, oleocanthal in olive oil, anthocyanins in blueberries, omega-3s in fatty fish, walnuts, purslane. These compounds exist in the whole food as nature and traditional agriculture produced it. They do not exist, or exist only in fractional amounts, in the refined, processed, industrially extracted versions of these same ingredients. Refined olive oil has had the oleocanthal removed. Heat-processed garlic powder has had the alliinase enzyme destroyed before allicin can form. Bottled green tea in most commercial forms has been heated past the temperature threshold that degrades EGCG. Purslane is composted. The parts of these plants that do the work are precisely the parts that modern food processing removes because they are the parts that make food harder to manufacture, store, and ship at industrial scale. The ancient world did not refine its food. Not because it was primitive, because there was no industrial incentive to destroy what worked. Every civilization in this video: Egypt, Israel, China, India, Greece, Rome, Mesoamerica. Celtic Europe arrived at the same foods through observation, sustained across generations. They did not have clinical trials. They had something in some ways more demanding: the accumulated, self-correcting, generationally tested observation of what kept people well. The research is only now explaining the biochemistry behind what they found. The question worth sitting with: what else did the ancient world know that we have not yet thought to measure? If this gave you something worth thinking about, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe if you haven't. Each week we go deeper into this territory, where ancient wisdom and modern science meet in ways most health content never reaches. Leave a comment telling me which of these 13 surprised you most. I read every one.